Okay, sorry, time ran out and I didn't recognize, so I will back up to briefly here. So, looking at the video, looks like I left off at 1618. So, again, the Peace of Augsburg was falling apart. Again, although it recognized the right of Lutherans to worship freely and openly within the borders of the empire itself, the same courtesy was denied to other Protestant sects, such as Calvinists. So what we see here again is the fragility, the inelasticity of these agreements, that they weren't being able to be to keep up with the changing climate and the changing times themselves. So, and the political climate. By 1619, Archduke Ferdinand is elected to become the next Holy Roman Emperor. And this is really the catalyst for the 30 Years' War itself, because it didn't take Protestants very long to understand and to recognize that, look, if this guy is persecuting and infringing upon the freedoms of Protestants within the Kingdom of Bohemia that had administered since 1617, um, what's to prevent him from taking that same policy and beginning to enforce it as best as possible as emperor across all of the Holy Roman Empire itself? And so, as a result, in 1619, Protestants refused to recognize him, refused to recognize Archduke Ferdinand as the succeeding emperor. They chose their own emperor, a man by the name of Frederick V. But this crisis, and Archduke Ferdinand's coming into power as the emperor was the catalyst for the 30 Years' War, the immediate catalyst. I mean, you can see the elements all in place, just waiting for some sort of flashpoint, that being this election, to serve as the trigger, you might say. The war itself is going to offer up some unique political alliances. I'll get into that in the kind of examples here in just a moment, but you can get a sense here that local discontent is going to escalate into war, and simply because it is begins to pit Protestants versus Catholics within the confines of the Holy Roman Empire, doesn't mean that it's going to stay within the Holy Roman Empire itself. And very quickly, tensions are going to rise all across of Europe. Catholic forces would enjoy early successes. King Philip, at the time King Philip VI of Spain, excuse me, King Philip IV of Spain, is going to ally with Emperor Ferdinand of the Holy Roman Empire. They were actually members of the same family, the Habsburg dynasty. Ferdinand was Philip's uncle. So Philip was representing the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty. Ferdinand was representing the Austrian branch of the Habsburg dynasty, both of which were ardent Catholics. And so you see an alignment here of Catholics, again, versus Protestants, as we might expect. Early in the first phase of the war itself, Protestant forces would be sent on their heels. They would be forced to kind of retreat um, from the Catholic forces arrayed against them. When they suffered an initial setback, the Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire began to turn to their northern allies, the Danes, the King of Denmark in particular, in order to bolster their forces. The King of Denmark agreed to this and moved his armies south to try and liberate Protestants from Catholic rule. When that happens, the Emperor Ferdinand is going to enlist the help of one of his leading generals, a man by the name of Albrecht von Wallenstein. Um, what's interesting about von Wallenstein is that he was a lesser noble looking to again advance his own interests, advance his wealth and his stature and political standing. He sees an opportunity to do so by kind of siding and throwing his lot in with the Catholics. So he's kind of a opportunist here, but he is also a Protestant. So even in the early stages of the 30 Years' War, a war that is largely along Protestant Catholic lines, we begin to see alliances emerging that begin to betray or to undermine the political dichotomy here. Again, von Wallenstein is not acting on religious principle; he's acting on political opportunity um, for his own betterment in this case. And this would happen not only in this instance, but as we'll see, it'll happen at other key points as well. One reason why von Wallenstein was interested in advancing his own position, and he was using kind of his efforts and accomplishments as a military tactician in order to do so, was because he realized that military success would allow him to plunder any territory that he and his army had occupied. And Ferdinand agreed to that policy. So this is one reason why von Wallenstein sought to kind of um, work in service of or to the uh, Holy Roman Emperor himself. By 1629, von Wallenstein succeeded in defeating the Danish king and his Protestant allies. And when that happens, in the very next year, 1630, it is going to be the King of Sweden, a man by the name of Gustavus Adolphus, who is going to come in on the side of the Protestants. Gustavus Adolphus himself was a Lutheran, and become the new champion of Protestant interests in the Holy Roman Empire. Now, by 1630, Adolphus had moved his massive army of some 100,000 troops. Um, he already had the bulk of them in what is today Poland, which he was trying to assume control over. And so now what he was doing in 1630 is to simply pivot those troops and begin to move them into the Protestant sections of the Holy Roman Empire itself to deploy against von Wallenstein, but also against the Emperor Ferdinand and the Catholic forces. Adolphus, for his part, wanted to control the profitable trade routes of Northern Europe, basically become the sovereign over the Baltic Sea itself. Um, and what's interesting is that the other major power of Europe at this time was France. Now, France, up to this point in the 30 Years' War, was and had remained largely neutral, even though it was a predominantly Catholic country, even though its head of state was a Catholic monarchy. They had remained, by and large, neutral in this conflict. Again, with a considerable Protestant population within the French countryside, France didn't want to exacerbate any type of bad blood between the Huguenots, those Protestants, and the Catholics within France itself. So they wanted to remain insulated from the conflict so that they could maintain a domestic security. But by this point, by 1630 or so, the French were interested and in beginning to try and pivot their neutrality or leverage their neutrality. People are increasingly setting sights on France, saying, who are you going to support? Are you going to be loyal to the Catholic school of thought and the Catholic camp, or are you going to, kind of uh, throw your weight behind um, uh, the Protestants. The French King Louis the 13th, was tasked with, being the head of state during this period of time. And he relied heavily on the advice of his chief advisor, a man by the name of Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu was a Catholic cardinal. I mean, he was part of the Catholic regime of the state of France. Um, and interestingly, the monarchy itself and the inner circle of which Richelieu was a part were suspicious over the Habsburg family and their potential windfall of power that they could amass for themselves should they be successful in this 30 Years' War. So, if you imagine a map of Europe, um, you have the Holy Roman Empire, basically what is primarily Germany today, um, in to lying to the east of France. And as I mentioned, that is governed, it is headed by um, Emperor Ferdinand, who is part of the Habsburg family. And then closely allied with the Spanish branch of the Habsburg family, who is the head of state in Spain, which is on the southern border of France. So, if the Habsburgs were going to be successful and the Catholic kind of uh, religion was going to be successful in this 30 Years' War, then this could pose almost a direct existential threat to France itself, with a united family on the immediate borders, contiguous land borders of France itself. And that would not necessarily be in the French France's interest, and the monarch's interest of France. And so, as a result, using what he described as raison d'etat, or reason of state, the equivalent of today's national interests, the the French begin to throw their support behind or ally themselves with the Swedes and Gustavus Adolphus and the Protestants, the Lutherans. Now, the Swedes won convincing victories, one of which was at the Battle of Lutzen um, in 1632. But in that conflict, Gustavus Adolphus is killed. And just 3 years later, in 1635, realizing that if they did not intervene, then the Catholics and with that the Habsburg family stood a very good chance of winning out in this war, the 30 Years' War. France officially entered the war in 1635, fighting on the side of the Protestants, a Catholic country, predominantly Catholic country, siding with the Protestants. Now, fighting would persist for almost another decade and a half, till until 1648, when there was the Peace of Westphalia that was going to end the conflict. But French involvement as early as 1635 marked the last and most significant turning point in the conflict itself. And once France entered into the conflict, there was little question as to who would prevail. And just as an aside here, it's important to understand or to discuss to a degree the amount of devastation and the wartime losses that were taking place and came about as a result of this conflict. It's during this 30 Years' War that we see the size of armies achieving pretty tremendous sizes. And with it, you have the vastly increased size of government bureaucracies in order to try and meet the needs of the wartime expenses and wartime demands. It was only the state that could equip and feed and field armies numbering, in some cases, 100,000 men or more. And in some cases, they didn't even do that very well, and troops went hungry and had to live off the land, which we'll address in just a moment. In some cases, weaker states had difficulty in meeting the needs. Um, in the case of Wallenstein's army, it pitched and kind of, as I said, lived off the land and pillaged for survival. Uh, there would be common occurrences where entire villages and towns would be destroyed. You have the hoarding of food and resources by marauding armies. They destroyed whatever they couldn't use or consume to keep it out of the hands of either the local inhabitants if they were in enemy territory, or out of the hands of the enemy armies themselves. And so as a result, this left the masses destitute, homeless, hungry, and impoverished. It also led to a great economic turmoil and economic drain, that monarchs themselves needed a great deal of money in order to raise the armies necessary. Well, uh, this traditionally would be met by imposing higher taxes on their respective subjects. But if the subjects themselves have their livelihoods ruined, and they are destitute, hungry, and impoverished, then there's no way that they would be able to pay any or generate any revenue um, for the state itself. And so other strategies had to be employed, other economic strategies had to be employed by the state in order to meet the needs and continue to try and fund in some way, shape, or form the war effort. Sometimes this meant resorting to devaluing the currency of the official state coin, which would lead to inflation, and also where states begin to turn to banking interests or private interests in order to help fund the war, going basically into deficit spending in order to and acquire loans in order to pay for the immediate needs of the war itself. So this is a pretty costly war, not only economically but socially as well, for much of the population of Europe. And there would be also a diplomatic significance and windfall to this 30 Years' War as well. It would be culminate in what's known as the Peace of Westphalia, which is in essence a series of treaties that ended the 30 Years' War. You had delegates from all major countries involved and meeting and negotiating simultaneously. So the idea of a conference table where you have different representatives from around the world sitting all at the same time and negotiating back and forth, that is born here in 1648 um, during the negotiations resulting in the Peace of Westphalia itself. It is a first for modern diplomacy. And this peace redefined the balance of power in Europe. France, first and foremost, replaces Spain as the most powerful European state. France acquired portions of the Holy Roman Empire, basically what is part of the Alsace region today. Sweden took control of some of the Holy Roman Empire's northern regions. Spain was forced to recognize Dutch independence, an independence movement that it had been trying to suffocate for the past 80 years or so, resulting in it's being called the 80 Years' War, which was just this conflict between Spain and its effort to retain control over the Netherlands. That was decided, and the Dutch won their independence from, or part of the Dutch won their independence from the Spanish, and their state was recognized. Um, German princes within the Holy Roman Empire were allowed to choose any religion for themselves and their subjects. So the Peace of Augsburg was kind of expanded to include not just Lutheranism, but also virtually any Protestant faith. And so as a result of these kinds of aspects, within the Holy Roman Empire itself, Lutheranism dominated primarily in the northern portions of what is today Germany. Catholicism remained dominant largely in the southern portions of Germany, with pockets of Calvinism existing in the eastern areas of Germany. And from 1648 to this day, in the 21st century, it's matters of state that would dominate international affairs and political matters. These were spheres that were no longer under the jurisdiction and under the influence of the church. So we have here in 1648 the installation of nationally interested policymaking and diplomacy. So just to recap here, Catholicism learned lessons from the Reformation, which it began to apply in what's known as the Counter Reformation. But arguably, they seem to be the wrong lessons. Rather than understand that the hierarchical and strict doctrinal practices of the church actually were contributors to the dissent that led to the Protestant Reformation, church leaders at the Council of Trent instead were happy to reinforce that type of policy and behavior within the Catholic Church itself. So it takes a more hardline approach, a reactionary like approach to cracking down on any type of dissent within the remaining domain of the Catholic Church itself. And of course, that hardline approach was going to begin to filter into and spill over into the political sphere, from which the church would never recover as far as influence was concerned. 30 Years' War is going to prove that the state was more receptive to diplomatic maneuvering than the church was. And it's going to lead state interests to eclipse those of the church as well. And you're going to have these kinds of alliances of convenience. The unlikely alliance of a Catholic dominant France allying itself with a Protestant oriented Sweden, but then also northern portions of the Holy Roman Empire itself. Not because of any compromise of religious values per se, but more because they were concerned of the potential for the Habsburg dynasty, the Austrian and the Spanish branches of that family and of that dynasty, to become the new kind of lords of Europe in the balance of power system, and how France would not be able and could not tolerate and would not be able to sustain itself if that were the case. So, reasons of state, raison d'etat, becomes the operating system for the balance of power of Europe moving forward. So that brings us to the end. We got through that in uh, pretty quick fashion. And again, you can see here the rough kind of breakdown in the wake of the Peace of Westphalia, how there's this uh, consolidation of influence in predominant areas across Europe. Again, this is uh, painting with somewhat of a broad brush, but it's kind of more. Um, it's a little more accurate. You can see a little more consolidation than it was pre uh, 30 Years' War with that previous map on the previous slide. If you're wondering, where's England in all this? Well, England is suffering from a civil war during the bulk of the 30 Years' War, which means that it remains on the sidelines. A civil war between Catholics and Protestants. So while the rest of Europe is engaged in a Catholic versus Protestant and kind of the muddied waters of crossover loyalties and such, England, for its part, is suffering its own miniature version of the same kind of conflict, um, just minus the raison d'etat element. So we'll talk more about that in future lectures. But for now, that'll um, wrap it up for this one. I'll see you in the next lecture.